and mute your video now. If you need help doing that, just shout. I think just about everyone's done it. Kate, yeah, Kate, you got it, good. Okay. We are ready to roll. So Anjali is a BHS senior. She is one of our premier, not only school-wide activists around climate change, but well beyond that. I don't actually even know all the details of all the work she's done. I know she's spoken at conferences and was involved with climate strikes here in Massachusetts, is involved with Sunrise, which is a national, maybe international movement at this point. And I've had the incredible pleasure of being able to work with her a little bit this year around the junior advisories curriculum. And, you know, I'm just so in awe of her, and she's awesome. And so glad you're here, Anjali. So I'm handing it off to you. Take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Anjali. I'm a BHS senior. I'm an Environmental Action Club. And then outside of school, I am one of the general coordinators for the Boston climate strike. I'm a trainer and a member of the press and media team for Sunrise Boston, and I'm on the Hub Council, which is an advisory board for Sunrise National. And I think, actually, Mr. Grandy, you've inspired me. I think I'm going to start this off with a story about like why I got involved in climate activism with my own climate story. So my grandparents used to live in this little house in the middle of the woods in Homedale, New Jersey. And we would go there every like summer and during holidays, and I would love to explore the woods with my brother, hang out with my family, garden with my grandmother. It was like this little home away from home for me. And I kind of felt like it was untouchable. And then in 2012, I believe, Hurricane Sandy hit New Jersey. And that little house in the middle of the woods became completely isolated. Trees fell down on the long road to their house, so no one could get in. The trees took down their power, which included their telephone and their heat. So for 13 days in late October, my grandparents had to go into the woods around their house and collect firewood and bring it back and heat the one room in their house that had a fireplace, because it was the only room that they could like live in. And this was a really scary time for me and my family because the phone lines were down. They couldn't call us and tell us they were okay. And my grandparents are not young. And I remember like my entire family just worried and wondering like, what would happen? Would they be okay? And that was the first time that I had ever really felt like uncertainty about the safety of my family members, especially in the face of natural disaster. Eventually, like, we got neighbors to go over, and they made sure that my grandparents were okay. And eventually tree cutting people came and like took down all the trees and restored power so they could like contact us and kind of rebuild their lives. But for me, like, although they were safe, it was the first time that I had ever felt something like that, and it really shook me to my core. And it made me realize that like there were disasters like this happening all over the world all the time. And there were families who feared for their loved ones. There were people who were always feeling that fear that I did. And I couldn't stand by and let that happen to others because of the way that it had affected me. So that's like kind of the reason I decided to start taking action. And, I started doing small things, but it didn't feel like enough. So I got bigger and bigger and bigger. And now I am where I am today. So in Boston Climate Strike, I am a general coordinator, which means that I generally kind of attend calls with like national people, but also make sure that everything is going well on the teams and kind of foster some community. And it's really important for me to like have a group of passionate young people really engaged in political activism in a way that previously has never been seen in the way it is now, especially in regard to climate change. I think that this period of time is the first time in which like kids, my age, younger, are really getting involved and showing up and saying, you know, our voices are powerful and we like are important to politicians, and this is our futures that people are trading away. So all of Boston Climate Strike is under the age of 20, and all of Sunrise is under the age of 35. And that really puts people at in a very unique position where, you know, we have the most to lose to climate change. And this gives us like almost more authority than many others. And for me, like being in a space of other passionate young people is really, really inspiring. And it's kind of what keeps me going and keeps me engaged in activism. Yeah, I think that like, I don't know about any of you, if you guys are interested, but honestly, climate leadership or stuff like that can look like anything for anyone. I'm like general coordinator, but there are people on teams, there are team leads, there are people who can't necessarily get involved in an organization, but are still doing vital work like at home. And I think that's something that really draws me to activism, is the fact that it's so kind of welcoming. You don't have to be an expert in order to kind of join or get involved, because young people are in this unique position of seeing their futures like fading away because of climate change. Yeah. And yeah, I think if anybody has any questions for me, I don't know how long I've been talking, but I feel like it's been about 10 minutes.
Oops, sorry. I'm saying it, definitely not too long. I have to close my door because there's a helicopter flying over my head. All right. Questions for Anjali? Any questions at all? If you want to, you can unmute your mics or just raise your hand and I'll unmute you. But again, anything at all just broadly related to climate change, about her being a student doing climate change work, something you want to say, doesn't have to be a question, but I really want this to be more of a conversation. I know we're a little bit out of practice on that, with that on Zoom. Comments, questions for Anjali? Anybody? Okay, I'm going to throw something out there while people are pulling questions together. You know, one thing you mentioned in your climate story was, which by the way was a powerful, powerful story and scary and intense, but it involved an extreme weather event, right? Which is this really large hurricane that hit, you know, the coast as far as New York and New Jersey a bunch of years ago. You know, I mean, I guess I'm wondering is like, for people that don't have a connection to an extreme event, a wildfire, a hurricane, flooding, a heat, extreme, you know, heat, drought, how do people connect to climate change personally? I mean, Boston is a fairly we're not going to feel some of the most extreme events here. We're going to have probably more intense rain. Our temperature is going to go up. There'll be some coastal flooding depending where you live. Not to minimize that at all, because that could be easily billions of dollars of hits to our economy. But how can people who haven't had even the experience like you had connect to climate change, would you say?
Yeah, it's actually really interesting because something that the Sunrise Movement is really good at is storytelling. One of Sunrise's principles is we tell our stories and we honor each other's stories, because they understand that storytelling does not have to be like this specific thing. Really, storytelling storytelling is used to communicate values with one another. So maybe you have a story about a time that you like helped another kid on the playground, and that value of like compassion and unity can then be translated into something climate related. But you don't have to have gone through a natural disaster in order to feel like you can speak on something related to climate change, if that makes sense.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Again, folks, as soon as you have a comment or a question, just unmute yourself and talk over me, or just raise your hand. But I really want to strongly encourage you to take this opportunity to talk to Anjali. I wanted to also ask you about kind of what it means, and you did speak about this a little bit, but one of the things I've sort of been talking a lot about is this concept of this idea of social solidarity. And, we talked about that a little bit at our event about a week ago or so, that has come up a lot around conversation with COVID-19, the pandemic. The idea that we are interconnected, that my fate rests in yours and vice versa. And that having a stronger web of connections, a more integrated social connection to people, gives us strength. And that we're asking people, when we have a strong sense of social solidarity, our government, our society is able to ask things of people to give of themselves. When there's not a lot of social solidarity, that request is a lot harder. We're asking people right now to socially distance. We're asking people to not go to work, right? We're asking people to assume tremendous amount of hardship for the sake of our future, for the sake of our health. So I wonder if you could tell me what it means to be part of an organization like Sunrise, and what kind of sense of connection and strength that gives you.
Yeah, I guess one way I like to describe this is I came to Sunrise for the activism, and I stayed because of the community. Sunrise really emphasizes community and connection, and working together towards a common goal. So it's really rooted in like people's personal experiences, as well as like we often sing with one another or like chant or tell stories. And this kind of connection, not only, does it make people more likely to join the movement, but it also makes the movement stronger in the long term. Because if you invest in those connections and you invest in other people, like you can create this like unified, singular mass of very passionate people, who care about one another and are willing to come to each other's aid. And that not only makes for more effective decision making, but it also makes for a much more welcoming community.
I love that from the outset. That kind of sounds like, oh, that's so idealistic. But as a matter of fact, it's actually really practical and real. I mean, you're all putting that into practice, not in a kind of way that's like gonna fizzle out, but it's like meaningful, and it's building a true foundation for making change. So I personally love the way that sounded. Again, folks, jump in, global leaders. By the way, the second word in the name of this class is leadership, Anjali. So I would love for you to talk a little bit more about what it means. I mean, I don't know if anyone's born a leader, probably not, but you decided to become one. How did you get to make that decision? And how did that process happen for you? And actually, before you answer that, I see Melanie's hand going up, so I'm going to strike while the iron is hot here. Take it away, Melanie.
I was going to ask, like, how you personally stay, like, motivated and, like, inspired in this, like, fight for a sustainable future, since sometimes it can feel like there's, like, so much that needs to be done. Like, how do you stay, like, inspired and motivated in your fight?
Absolutely. So I think there is a lot of like bad news out there, and it's really, really easy to get discouraged. But I stay motivated by honestly like looking at other people and like what they're doing, because I think, if you're feeling really sad about something that happened in the world related to maybe a natural disaster or something climate related, and then you look somewhere else and you see like all of these kids like standing up for what they believe in, and like using their power as young people to make a real difference, like seeing that, not just in person, but on videos, like all around the world, it's extremely inspiring. And honestly, like to me, it's like if other kids can stand up and do this, like I can too. And also just that also gives me a sense of like everybody is in this together and everybody is working together. Because often, especially nowadays, you can feel like you're stuck, you're isolated, you're doing nothing with other people, it's all on you. But being able to kind of break out of that mindset and realize that maybe everyone's feeling this way or everyone's trying to do their part, um, and kind of seeing that more in person when you see collective action being taken, but also online, you can see like there are people out there who are doing the same thing as you. And if we all work together, we can get through this and we can make the change that we need.
Thank you.
Mr. Grandy, you are muted.
Excellent point. I said while I was muted. Do you want to give, Melanie, I was saying, Melanie, first off, you want to follow up, just jump in over me. Do you want to give a couple examples of some things that, I mean, all that kind of social solidarity and connection and, activism you talked about? I mean, you got to have some wins. Otherwise, it's, the hopelessness is just going to compound, I think. So how do you turn that around with some wins? What are some things that Sunrise has done that's actually demonstrating we are moving in the right direction? The activist community, at least, is moving in the right direction.
Okay, so Sunrise has actually done quite a bit. If any of you have heard of the Green New Deal, kind of the reason for that is Sunrise, whether you know it or not. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ed Markey did propose the bill, but it really didn't gain a lot of traction until Sunrise kind of took that on and brought it to politicians, brought it to the public, the media, and really made it very loud and like made people hear about it. And also, honestly, Sunrise really helped with bringing climate change in general to the forefront. Before Sunrise did a sit-in in Nancy Pelosi's office in 2018, people really weren't talking about inaction on climate change, or if they were referring solely to Republicans. And something that Sunrise does is Sunrise goes and they talk to people who are already in power, who may be considered progressive, but not on issues like climate, and then kind of forces them to take stronger, bolder action. So as a result of what Sunrise has done, all of the Democratic presidential candidates or nominees had to come up with a climate platform in order to be considered viable to run for office. So it kind of brought action on climate change to the public and made it more of a pressing issue.
Awesome, thank you. And I would, and Anjali knows better than I do, but I can say that there is, we are at a new level of activity and consciousness in this country. And a lot of it comes from the younger generation pressing on, people my age and older. But I think that's a total fair assessment to say that Sunrise as an organization has really gained some leverage, right? It's hard now to be a denier or ignorer of climate change in politics as a result of Sunrise. Who else? Other question, comment? Okay, let me return to my question before, but anyone wants to jump in, unmute, raise your hand, either way, both. About leadership, Anjali, I mean, you decided to become a leader and so then you became one. So I'm kind of curious, how does that process go? I think oftentimes, at least for some students, I certainly felt this way as a kid. I mean, I probably didn't even think about it at all even. It was like, well, I'm just a teenager. How can I be a leader? I don't really know anything about leadership. It's not really kind of my thing. How do you get there? And then I want you to kind of give us some tangible examples. So and there's many takes on this, but what is your take? 2, 3, 4 key elements or components of leadership. But first, how you got there and how that happened.
Awesome. So believe it or not, actually, like if you met me a few years ago, I would not have spoken to you. I did not talk in school. I didn't talk in front of people. I was kind of terrified of everyone and everything. But I think it started first as a necessity. I felt like I had to take action on climate change. But I progressed through various organizations and did more activities, I saw like people my age standing up and speaking and fighting and protesting. And I originally didn't feel like teenagers had any power. I felt like we couldn't vote, we can't do anything. But I think in 2018, actually, I went to a sunrise action in Washington, D.C., and there were 1,000 people there. And people did sit-ins and they told stories and they sang and chanted, and I saw like politicians change their minds about issues regarding climate change and a Green New Deal in ways that I hadn't even thought possible, from a bunch of like high schoolers, college age kids, even 7-year-olds ranging from 7 to like 35, going into people's offices and telling stories. But it did end up changing people's minds. And it made me realize that young people are powerful and have a voice and have almost more authority in a room because of our stake in like our futures, which for me like made me realize that climate change and activism in general could be something that young people could do. And then from there, I just kind of went through various organizations and got more involved. And in more and more times, I was given more of a leadership position. Every time I was like, I'm too young for this. I don't feel like I can do this. And then I would be put in that position, and then I would, I guess, do okay in it. And then it made me realize that like young people are valid and like can have like very strong opinions and tell like older people, and especially like people in power, about what we believe in, if that makes sense.
It all makes a lot of sense. And I think, one of the key things you mentioned was what, your generation has going for you. And I mean, frankly, I speak about this too, because I have an 8-year-old. So it's her future that I'm feeling I need to fight for. But what, I think older people can't deny is that you are working to secure a future that is under threat. And that I think is an important part. I mean, as you all, talking to my students now, think about your story, say what you will, write what you will, whatever your connection is, but that might be something to kind of consider, is that, I tried to do this in the first week. Doing it online is not ideal, but to try to find a connection to even, a micro habitat in front of your house, which is like a bush, a tree, whatever, but to find something you appreciate, to have that naturalist connection, and then, the fight to secure it, right? To feel a personal connection of something you want to protect. It means more than protecting an individual tree, obviously. But to have that connection to nature, to understand what it is you have to protect. And as I've tried to make in this course, it's way more about habitat and species preservation. It's, all the threats to democracy, and it's the transformation and threats that come from mass migration, authoritarianism. These are things we've been talking about all year. So if the nature thing, and I read your interesting comments last week, I'm talking to my students now about, was it a week or two ago, about, your own connection to nature. Some of you said you have a profound connection to nature. You think about it all the time. And others like, I'm kind of like an urban teen, which that's not really on the forefront of what I think about day to day. And I totally understand that. And that's legitimate. But finding something that you want to connect to, whether it's nature or not, and knowing what you want to preserve, protect, or defend against, I think is something to consider as you weave that into your stories. I would love to see more, less mics with slashes through them. I'm going to go to sleep tonight, like with an image of a red microphone with a slash through it. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? I think you probably know. Other thoughts, comments? Okay, maybe we can get a little more technical. So where are things, well, what I want to get to, Anjali, and we're kind of moving towards the end, not quite yet, is sort of what students in this class can do, whether it's joining Sunrise or not. But what are some practical actions? Where are we at right now? Where do you see some of the greatest potential for making significant change? And by significant, I mean, I personally have worked on school stuff. If we compost better at the high school, we will not dramatically alter the trajectory of climate change, but we will create a culture and mindset, which our school absolutely has the responsibility to do. So I don't want to minimize it. But again, it's not going to be the be all or end all. So what are some key things, larger, big picture, fossil fuels, transportation, whatever, like what do these future leaders need to think about and understand about where we need to intervene? What are some of the big picture issues out there? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. If I'm going off track, like feel free to jump in, but
Take it away.
to be honest, like in terms of large scale, very significant changes need to be made in almost every sector of our society, in terms of like transportation, agriculture, housing, in terms of climate change, but also social justice and equity. And that feels like a lot for a lot of people. But I think the best way to create change at the scope and scale that is necessary to do all the things we need to do is through policy. So like political climate action. And that's what I'd encourage like everyone here to do, is to like join a political climate activist group, because like it is one thing to like spend a few years trying to get a composting system in BHS, which I did and took a lot longer than I thought it would. But it's another thing entirely to push for something like the Green New Deal, which for those of you who don't know is like a 10-year mobilization of like every sector of our society away from a fossil fuel-based infrastructure and towards a like more equitable and sustainable future, while at the same time making sure that communities most impacted by the climate crisis, which are usually like communities of color, low-income communities, like have a seat at the table and are able to be core parts of like decision making in regard to like what is going to happen with their communities and how their communities can become more resilient.
So let's move now towards specific things that students can do. And again, I would love them to speak up, which of course is one of the very first things you need to do is to speak up. But how can students get involved? What are some, I mean, you mentioned kind of the notion of getting involved. What are some specific ways? Maybe certainly include Sunrise and what that looks like right now, but maybe if someone's not motivated to do that, give us a couple examples of some things that people on this call can do.
Yeah. So one thing that's really easy, like right now at home, is like phone banking or text banking, which is where you like call or text a bunch of people and ask them to ask their politicians to do something, in terms of like, oh, support this candidate or ask this candidate to support this bill. And that's something that you can do from home. Sunrise Boston, if you join Sunrise Boston, which I would encourage all of you to do, although Brookline is potentially starting its own Sunrise Hub, is cool. But there's like, if you look up Sunrise Boston, you can find ways to get involved, and there's lots of projects kind of happening all the time. I would also encourage like, especially like people here who like are my age or younger, to join Boston Climate Strike. I can't give a lot of details because we're currently in like a restructuring process. Yeah. So we don't have specific ways for people to join right now. Or we're considering a restructuring process. Yeah, I think if you feel like you have the time or energy to get involved in like a specific youth climate organization, I would definitely encourage you to do so. if you feel like you don't have time, you can do political action through, like I said, phone banking or text banking. You can also like call your politicians' offices and stuff like that. But also if you feel like, oh, I don't want to get involved in like political things, I think the second biggest thing to do is education and making sure that like you're telling your friends about things like climate change, and not just like the polar bears and the melting ice caps, but also the human effects or the impacts of climate change on humans. And as well as like adults, because I think adults need to start learning how to listen to young people more. It's started to happen more recently, but I think practicing talking to older people and educating older people is one of like the best ways to get started in like advocating for yourself and standing up for what you believe in.
Okay, before you speak, Sam, I just want to read a couple of things. So one is beginning to practice advocating for yourself, standing and beginning to build that internal script about what you believe, I think is really important. I mean, frankly, I do that all the time when I'm listening to podcasts, reading. I think about how would I articulate that when I'm talking to someone else. So finding some of those words, for me, that was probably the biggest barrier to entry to get involved in anything, was kind of not knowing quite what to say. I certainly did not know that as a high school student, I can tell you that. But you can begin kind of finding that internal script, and as Anjali said, finding a personal connection. You know, so-and-so this is really important to me because. But you mentioned signing up on Sunrise to go to Sunrise Boston. Just get on the email list. You mentioned school. What's it called? School strike.
Boston Climate Strike?
Boston.
Climate Strike.
Sorry, Boston Climate Strike. Just get on the email list for that, and you'll start getting stuff. The other organizations I listed at the bottom have a bunch of things. You know, the Yale climate communication thing, I get something from them, I think weekly. They're tiny articles that would fit within one screen, but are really interesting about things happening. So just to kind of get some of your information going is great. 350.org is one of the premier activist organizations probably globally. Right now, Bill McKibben is the leader of that and is incredibly prolific and knows as much as anyone. The Alliance for Climate Education, which is focused on education. I mean, those sites are all listed at the right above part 5 on the document. So just start poking around on some of those. Sam, go ahead. And then I think we're going to start wrapping up.
Okay, so I just wanted to ask about what was like the Sunrise Movement. What is it? What like the work you're doing on like the local and state levels? Because like hanging in like this in the state of Massachusetts, you can definitely like do a lot of change at the state level, and it can make like a big difference, even if like it can, even if it's not on like the on a level like that of a nation.
Do you want specifically what Sunrise is, or what Sunrise is working on right now?
Like what you're working on with like regards to like Massachusetts and Boston.
Cool. So I personally am on the trainings team, and we're like doing orientation trainings for new people who want to get involved in Sunrise. But in general, like Sunrise Boston as a whole is really advocating for some national stuff in terms of what is called a people's bailout, where like basically we're trying to ask like national Congress to prioritize people and not corporations when they like give money away to like save our economy. But more locally, people are trying, like, are in the works of creating a Massachusetts specific Green New Deal and the policies that would go along with that. But there's also a lot of bills currently about environmental justice and toxics levels in certain parts of the state, as well as some renewable energy bills. And then like currently right now in terms of COVID, there's a lot of stuff about like rent freezes and like some stuff about like squatters who are in a house but might not necessarily be legally in that house, and other things in terms of mutual aid projects and helping like our local communities. Because honestly, like we can try and do like all of this stuff at the national level. And that's great. And like, if things get passed and happen, that's awesome. But the more realistic, and as well as like stuff that is more easily like has tangible benefits to you, is to do stuff more locally. So in Brookline, like if you want to spend all your energy focusing on like the national stuff, that's fine. But like focusing on Brookline stuff is definitely going to affect you more than something that's happening in Congress.
Quick addition to that, and I think that was a fantastic comment and a great question, Sam. You know, even though we have a federal government, it's not just the president, but you know, many people around him who are really bent on environmental destruction. I mean, their policies literally are destructive. We actually are on track for an overall, I believe, reduction in emissions in the United States, and that's because of local action. It's because of what some states and many cities are doing just on their own. So local action is actually incredibly consequential, not just in climate change, but on any issue. Many people talked about how when one local community takes action, for example, Brooklyn Public Schools is behind many of our neighboring communities. But you know, those of us working on that are inspired by those neighboring communities. We look to them to be able to then go back to our community here and say, well, look at Concord and Carlisle's doing, look what Lexington's doing, look at Arlington has done. So it's powerful to do local change. It also, I think, feels very personally connected when you can see your local community, your local school, your classroom, and you can get very local, your household, right? I mean, that local stuff matters. And once you begin to build some success in that, it can begin to transmit to others and become infectious to others. So I think that's an important thing. Just one quick thing is there's a big fight over a compressor station. I don't understand all the issue in Weymouth. Anjali, you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so the Weymouth natural gas compressor station is currently being built and proposed by a company called Enbridge, which has a lot of issues with like a lot of pipelines around the country right now. But the state of Massachusetts has said that this is not a necessary compressor station that needs to be added. We have enough natural gas, we have enough energy to power our entire state. The primary purpose for implementing it is actually an economic one. The compressor station will give the state of Massachusetts more money. But ideologically, it means that we are allowing fossil fuel companies to come into our state and build things and add more natural gas to our energy system, even though it's unnecessary. And it's kind of the opposite, going in the opposite direction of where we want to be going in terms of environmental sustainability and renewable energy. So, and there's also a lot of like moral and ethical questions about Enbridge in general in terms of where it's placing its pipelines, but also just the health effects of a natural gas compressor station in a community. Was that?
Yeah, we're gonna add something, someone's gonna follow up? Okay, just to clarify exactly what that is, I don't have a deep understanding of this, but you know, the natural gas that we use to power our homes, etc., is piped here. It doesn't come by truck. There are literally, you can look at some of the web of gas pipelines in the United States, and you will be blown away of the thousands and thousands of miles. Some of the stuff's coming from Canada. Some of it's coming from the Gulf region, like Gulf of Mexico region. There are pipelines all around the country. And so this compressor station is about adding more natural gas infrastructure, meaning we're investing money, investing long-term in relying on a fossil fuel, natural gas, rather than investing in renewable sources. And as a friend of mine who's a environmental scientist explained, you know, compressor stations essentially they're like pumping stations. They're going to pressurize the movement of this gas, right? It can't just kind of drift like water by gravity. It needs to be pumped along the way because it's traveling a long distance. And these stations are designed to have some leak, in other words, to release some of the pressure. So there's not too much high pressure in them. So they are designed to release methane, which is a way worse fossil fuel than carbon dioxide into the environment. And as Anjali said, these are sited near where people live, and so they're having direct exposure to those emissions. So for health reasons, for how we're going to orient our economy, etc., I think it's a worthy battle to try to stop this. I don't know if he's still doing this. There was a BU professor who was actually on hunger strike to try to raise awareness around the compressor station. Any last comments from Anjali, from anyone else before we wrap? My computer's a little bit frozen here. I'm hoping you guys can hear me. Any last comments at all? You can unmute yourself because my computer's frozen. Anything at all? Okay, I can't even effectively say goodbye right now because I'm in frozen mode. Why don't people follow up with me online if you want to? But I want to say thank you so much to Anjali. Again, I hope you guys can hear me right now. Okay, good. I just heard that because nothing else is working on my screen. But let's give Anjali a Zoom applause, thumbs up or blue hands or whatever you want to give. And thank you. And I'll be in touch with folks online. Write me with comments, write me with questions, put some energy and thought into the assignment this week. Just do what you can. I'm not expecting you to completely revamp your life, but begin taking it to the next step. So everybody, I'll see you all soon. Take care. And again, thank you so much to Anjali. All right, if you guys want to unmute to say goodbye, that'd be cool.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Guys,
you.
any other
Thank
questions?
you.
Mr. Grandy has my email.
Yeah, if you want to connect to Anjali individually, write me and I'll get you connected. Anjali, you're awesome. You continue to be awesome, and I'll be in touch with you.
All right. Thank
Okay.
you so much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
All right, good night.
Take care, Sam.
All right. Bye, Mr. Grandy.
Okay, Anjali, be well. I'll be in touch with you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Okay, bye.
Bye.